Hi everyone, this is Jarian. I'm going to explain some basic UV tips and tricks. We'll cover a few things in this video. First, I'll talk about customizing your default settings for the UV unwrapper so that every time you add an unwrap UVW modifier, it uses the settings that you want. Then I'll go over the difference between unwrapping a primitive directly versus unwrapping an editable poly. I'll talk about how the object scale affects the relax UVW command, and then we'll look at good seam placement and bad seam placement and how to identify where to put UV seams so that the UVs relax properly. So first, let's look at customizing your default UV settings. I'll just make a cube and add an unwrap UVW modifier. I've just added the modifier to my custom modifier sets here so that I always have the button visible. So if you click Open UV Editor and go to the Options menu and then Preferences, we can set preferences like different colors and settings. So for example, let's say I want it to show the grid. I click Show Grid and hit OK. Then we can go to Options and click Save Current Settings as Default. And now if I even delete this, make a new object, add an unwrap UVW modifier. Now I see the grid in the background. So this saves it as the default in 3ds Max, not just this scene. So you can have your UV unwrapping preferences set however you like on your machine. There are a few other preferences that I recommend setting. One thing is the relax dialog box. So you can see I've actually already set this to be different from what the default is. The default sets this to relax by edge angles and the iterations of 100. 90% of the time I use polygon angles. I really only use edge angles to unwrap a very dense mesh with vertices close together. Otherwise, I use polygon angles. I like to turn the iterations up so that when I hit apply, I can just let it keep going without stopping too soon. So once I've set this, I can close it. And then one other thing I'd like to do is toggle on the always bring up the edit window. So we can see now that's on. And again, I'm going to click Save Current Settings as Default. So then Max remembers those settings the next time I add an unwrap UVW modifier. So now, when I do that, it automatically brings up the Edit UVWs window as soon as I add the modifier or select an object that has the unwrap UVW modifier on it. That's just a time saver, so I don't have to click this button every time I want to edit the UVs. It'll also remember where the Edit UVWs window was on your screen. And under Relax, it remembers my settings here that I like to use. All right, so next let's look at the difference between adding an unwrap UVW to a primitive versus an editable poly or an edit poly. So we can see right here, we just made a box and then put the unwrap UVW right on top of it. So I have my select by element UV toggle turned on. I'll go to polygon subobject mode. And you can see we only have 3 polygon subobjects in our unwrap UVW window, even though the cube obviously has 6 sides. So what happens when you add an unwrap UVW modifier directly on top of a primitive is Max screws up the associations between vertices and corresponding UVs. If I rotate around, I can see that even though I only have this one UV shell selected, it's somehow corresponding to polygons on opposite sides of the box. Max has welded those UVs together, even though on the actual mesh, the vertices are not welded together or even touching. We can also see this is causing some weird triangulation due to the way Max is overlapping those faces and welding them. This is not good and not what we want. So instead, let's delete that unwrap UVW modifier, add an edit poly modifier. We don't have to do anything in it, it just has to be there. And then add an unwrap UVW modifier. And now we can see we properly have a different UV sub-object, a different UV element, that is, for each face of the cube. So really, before unwrapping anything, just make sure to add an edit poly modifier. All right, let's look at scale now. The basic idea is, in order for the relax UVs command to work correctly, the scale of your object has to be set to 100% on the X, Y, and Z axes. So I'm going to go to the scale tool and hit F12 to bring up the transform type in window, and we can see that all my scales are set to 100%. So what if I scale this higher? Now, if I try to unwrap this and unfold the UVs, by using the relax command, it's not going to look right. Let's make sure to display the checker pattern here. We can see that it's stretched vertically. I'm going to select these all. And when I click relax, notice that Max is not actually properly changing the area of the faces. It's supposed to have the area of the face in the UVs match the area of the actual mesh, but clearly that's not the case. It's still stretched. What Max is doing is scaling these to the size they would be if this was at 100%, but it's not. So the scale is wrong. There's not a perfect solution for this, but there are a few workarounds. So one thing we can do is reset the transform. The downside to that is that this collapses the modifier stack. So it's not ideal if you have a complex modifier stack that you want to maintain. So we can click on the Tools menu and then click on the Edit menu and go to the Transform toolbox and click on this R button, which resets the X form. So this has now collapsed everything down into one editable poly object, and it's also set all the scales to 100%. So now if we add an unwrap UVW modifier, see the checker pattern that's clearly distorted. If we select all of these UV shells, go to relax, and it finds the proper scale for them. So the checker is properly displaying as squares instead of rectangles. So it's not ideal to have to collapse the stack in order to unwrap something properly. So really, you should always just avoid scaling an object. If we need to scale an object, we should scale it at the element level instead of at the object level. So the ideal way to do that would be to make your box, say you have this, and then you realize after the fact, if it's already collapsed down, so you no longer have the inch or dimension parameters for the box, you realize after the fact that it needs to be taller. Instead of scaling it this way, which causes the object scale to not be at 100%, let's undo that and go to Element Subobject, select the entire element and scale it. Obviously now it's scaling from the center, so we'd have to move it up. Alternatively, we could go to Polygon Subobject and just move this top face to where we need it to be. So basically, we should do our transformations on a sub-object level instead of an object level so that our object scale stays at 100%. So now if we add an unwrap UVW and relax, it finds the correct proportions without having to reset the transform. All right, next let's look at proper seam placement. Sometimes it seems simple, but it's easy to screw up, and there are a few simple guidelines that can help us along. Let's make another cube. And add an edit poly, and then an unwrap UVW modifier. So by default, every face is separate, which is often not what we want. So to eliminate all the seams, let's do a planar map. I don't actually want this to be planar mapped. The way the planar projection works, though, removes all the seams, and that way we can manually add the seams where we want them. So I selected all my faces. I'll click the planar map button here. And for the sake of simplicity, let's just project it along the angle we're looking at it from. So this is what these faces now look like in the UV editor. I hit 3 twice to exit the planar map and to go into my face subobject mode. We can edit these as we need to and display the checker pattern, which obviously is stretched. So let's cut our seams where we want them. I'll go to Edge subobject mode, turn off Select by Element UV toggle. So here's an example of bad seam placement. I'm just going to select the seams around where we can see, or select the edges, that is, around where we can see, and then cut seams by going to Tools and Break. So Max will display the broken UVs in green. I can now select by element and drag these apart. Oops, that was scale. Let's go to our Move tool. So these are our 2 UV shells. We can select them and relax. I have a hotkey set to bring up the relax dialog box. And what we can see is it's still distorting, and the reason for that is we have not created enough seams to be able to properly unfold. So where do we need to put those seams? A cube is a pretty simple example, and it's easy to tell. We want to cut some seams along here. But to pin down the rule for that, the place we want to put these seams is at 3-pointed stars or 5-pointed stars. So what that means is a vertex where you have either 3 or 5 edges all coming together. So this vertex would be a 3-pointed star because we have 1, 2, 3 edges all coming off of that one vertex. An example of a 5-pointed star would be something like this. Let's duplicate our object. And I'll collapse this down for now. Add an extra edge there so that we can extrude out a face. Oops. Extrude out a face. So this vertex here would be a 5-pointed star because it's one vertex that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 edges all coming together. So what we notice about that is where we have 3-pointed stars and 5-pointed stars is where we need the topology to change direction. So basically, any place we have those, what I refer to as poles, we have faces that are really going at 3 different angles. So here we have this vertical angle, this front section, and then this bottom section at an overhang. We have the same thing here. Obviously, these 3 faces are each at different angles. So when you have 3 different angles coming together, if they're steep enough angles, like right angles here, we can't really unfold them and keep them together without distortion. So the poles at the 3-pointed and 5-pointed stars are just a good visual indicator of where we'll need a UV seam. So in order to get this to unfold properly, we just need to cut an extra edge anywhere where we see a pole that has all 3 edges unsplit. I think I got them all. So now let's break those. And now, if we relax all those, should be able to give it the proper area. So right now it's slanted just because these are slanted. It'll look pretty good if we pack it. Oops, let's close this dialog box. Looks like it didn't quite get it. So just for the sake of example, let's rotate them manually so that we can see it looks all right. So that looks pretty good. We can sew them back together if we need to using stitch. Same thing with this example. If we unwrap it and do a planer map to get rid of all the seams, and then manually cut some seams in. Say we just cut this. I'm going to go to my right-click menu here just to bring up the context-sensitive menu and do break. If I select all these, do a hotkey to bring up the relax dialog box. You can see this one keeps on going because it can't quite relax properly. This one has, and let's look at what the checker texture looks like. But we don't have enough seams here to properly relax it. So if we cut some extras, then we can relax it. We want to make sure that any place where we see one of these poles or stars, we have at least one cut edge. So Max was almost able to get it. Looks like these here are still not quite right. Let's try that one more time. So the reason for that is these are all welded together all around there. We need to cut one extra edge across so that these can unfold. Right now it's kind of what's referred to as an accordion fold. These UVs are basically folded over themselves. We need to cut across there to give it at least one place to break apart. And now it can do it. So we can select everything, set them to the same scale, pack them, and tell it to allow them to rotate. And now it fits much nicer. So these are really simplified examples. Let's look at a more common example. The back of a sofa, basically. So this is still pretty basic, but this is to emulate this type of sofa back, where it's essentially a cube shape with an extra piece extruded down, and it has these kind of holes cut in where the arms are a separate piece. So let's step through the modifier stack here and see what it looks like. So this is my very basic shape, and when I still have this, before I add any more detail, I unwrap it. The lower polygon the mesh, the easier it is to unwrap. You can see I've cut in seams so that I can create 3 separate pieces. So let's see what would happen if I didn't have enough seams. I'm going to select all these and planar map them. And let's planar project along the y-axis. And it looks like this. So if I go to edge mode and cut in edges, say I only want to cut out the back of the sofa seat, saying we're looking at it from the front and I want to avoid any visible seams. This appears to have reset to edge angles. I may have saved this scene before I set my preferences. So if I relax that and move these shells apart, it's not quite enough to work. We can kind of see the shape here of this middle face with the other faces around it, but as long as they're welded to these outside parts where we have all these three-pointed stars, there aren't quite enough seams to unfold it properly. So we need to break off the front and back also. We can loop UVs at least part of the way around. And then remember, we need that one additional seam across here to sort of unweld this whole area around so that it can actually open up. Actually, it looks like we already had that seam right. We had several of them, so I can undo that last seam I created. Looks like this back part got a little screwed up. It's not quite unfolding this triangle. I'm not sure what happened there, but we can reproject by selecting just those faces and doing a planar map. It looks better now. Let's turn on our checker texture. So these are pretty close. And now we can select them all. Oh, so I think this one is relaxing wrong because it's inverted. This is the back side. So in order to relax it properly, we actually have to reverse it. So we can go here and hold down and do mirror horizontally. Oops, that was the wrong one. We had it right the first time. And now let's relax it. And it did relax properly. So that just comes from whether the planar projection is going this direction from the front or this direction from the back. We can relax all of them. And again, give them a consistent scale. Let it rotate. And pack them if we want to. All right. So then going up the stack, if we're trying to make this look more realistic, I added another edit poly here just to cut these seams in, and another edit poly here where I just shaped it a little more realistic. And then I turbo smoothed it to round out those chamfered corners. This last unwrap, let's delete that. We'll recreate it to show you what it looks like. So right now, when I add that unwrap on top of the turbo smooth, it's remembering the placement of all these, but we can see when we turbo smooth, the edges of the UV shells get this sort of pulled or pinching effect. So if we turn on our checker pattern, kind of zoom in on one of those areas, we're getting a little bit of this pinching over there. So we can easily fix that by just selecting all the UVs and then relaxing on top of the turbo smooth. And it straightens them out. If we zoom in on those corners now, it more closely matches the shape of the mesh. So we really did all our UV unwrapping at the very lowest level, at the simplest mesh with the fewest edges. We added in these extra edges in turbo smooth, and then after the turbo smooth, all we had to do was unwrap. So if you do something like extrude faces, you will have to re-unwrap the new faces. But we typically want to avoid unwrapping a really dense mesh, such as on top of a turbo smooth. So we did our unwrap at the lowest, simplest level made the edits that we needed to, and then all we have to do to the more complex shape is simply relax the UVs to avoid pinching. So hopefully this helps you with UV unwrapping meshes. These are just some basic steps to make things go more smoothly.